November 30th, 1942, Rosneath, Scotland. Lieutenant Commander James Patterson stepped onto the rain-slicked pier at U.S. Naval Operating Base 2 and stared at what should have been impossible. 8 massive fuel tanks rose from mud that had been nothing but sheep pasture 6 months earlier. A marine railway capable of hauling 1,500-ton submarines stretched into the dark waters of the Gare Loch. 20 Nissen huts formed perfect rows where ancient oak trees had stood in July, and moored alongside the weathered USS Beaver, 3 sleek Gato-class submarines, each 311 feet 9 inches of American steel and machinery, bobbed gently in the Scottish mist. How did they build all this in 6 weeks? Patterson had served at Pearl Harbor. He knew what it took to establish a submarine base. Years of planning, millions in concrete, permanent piers driven deep into bedrock. Yet here, on this remote Scottish peninsula 24 miles northwest of Glasgow, the U.S. Navy had conjured a fully operational forward submarine base from raw coastline with a speed that defied every engineering timeline he'd ever seen. When civilian contractors departed in June, they'd left construction materials scattered across muddy fields, foundation work incomplete, and no mooring facilities capable of handling submarines. The 29th Naval Construction Battalion, the Seabees, had arrived in late November to find chaos and Submarine Squadron 50 already crossing the Atlantic with an expected arrival in days, not months. They had built it anyway. The miracle wasn't just that Rosneath existed, the miracle was that it existed now, ready to support offensive submarine operations against German U-boats and Axis shipping in European waters at the exact moment Allied strategy demanded it. Every day earlier meant more patrols launched, more convoy lanes secured, more pressure on Germany's Atlantic lifeline. The strategic mathematics were brutal. The base had to be operational before winter storms made construction impossible and before the narrow window for pre-invasion submarine operations closed forever. What Patterson was examining represented a revolution in American military engineering, the ability to project naval power anywhere on Earth by building the infrastructure to support it faster than enemies could react to its existence. The German U-boat command, convinced the remote Scottish coast was a strategic backwater, had no idea that American submarines were about to launch attacks from a base materialized out of nothing on their doorstep. They had no idea. If you're enjoying this story of ingenuity and strategic surprise, hit like to help us bring more of these forgotten stories, and subscribe for more. What happened next from this impossible base would change the tide of war. The journey to this moment had begun 17 months earlier, in July 1941, when the first American civilian contractors arrived at Rosneath Bay under arrangements made between the British and American governments through the Lend-Lease Act. The United States wasn't yet at war. Pearl Harbor lay 5 months in the future, but both nations understood what was coming. The Firth of Clyde offered deep water channels ideal for submarine operations, protected anchorages where tenders could moor safely, and the flatlands of Rosneath Estate provided sufficient space for shore facilities. Heavy forest cover offered natural concealment from German reconnaissance aircraft that routinely photographed Scottish military installations. The 996 Dock Operating Company, Royal Engineers, had already established tented accommodation around Rosneath House when 325 American civilian workers, 1,000 Irish laborers, and 250 British construction workers began transforming the peninsula. Throughout summer and fall 1941, shiploads of heavy construction equipment arrived from the United States: bulldozers, concrete mixers, cranes, pile drivers, electrical generators. The original plan called for destroyer facilities, submarine operations areas, repair shops, ammunition storage, fuel farms, a 680-bed hospital, and barracks for thousands of personnel, essentially a complete naval operating base built from nothing on foreign soil. But the work proceeded slower than strategic necessity demanded. A critical equipment shortage, no rock crusher, meant aggregate had to be trucked 25 miles from the nearest quarry, delaying every project requiring concrete. Shortages of steel reinforcing bar, electrical cable, and pipe fittings cascaded through the construction schedule. By December 7, 1941, when the United States entered the war and strategic priorities immediately shifted, construction remained incomplete on barracks, hospital facilities, reservoirs, access roads, and the critical water filtration plant. Plans for destroyer facilities were canceled entirely. The submarine support infrastructure became the absolute focus. The original contractors pushed through winter and spring 1942, making steady progress despite Scottish weather that seemed designed to thwart construction. Then in June 1942, they were suddenly reassigned to a massive petroleum pipeline project in Dumbartonshire. The base stood partially complete, usable by the Royal Navy for convoy escort maintenance, but not ready for offensive submarine operations requiring torpedo workshops, extensive fuel storage, and maintenance facilities for complex diesel-electric propulsion systems. On September 3, 1942, the U.S. Navy established Submarine Squadron 50 at New London, Connecticut, under Captain Norman S. Ives, a 1920 Naval Academy graduate who had won the Navy Cross in 1931 for his pioneering work developing submarine rescue equipment. 6 brand-new Gatto-class submarines, USS Blackfish, SS-221, USS Gunnell, SS-253, USS Shad, SS-235, USS Herring, SS-223, USS Barb, SS-220, and USS Gurnard, SS-254, were pulled from Pacific assignments and designated for Atlantic deployment. Their mission? Support Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa scheduled for November 8, then establish forward anti-U-boat patrols from Scotland. On October 19, 1942, the first 3 submarines departed New London for Scotland. On October 20th, 2 more followed. The 6th would depart shortly after. The ancient tender USS Beaver, a converted 1910 passenger steamer, 380 feet long, displacing 6,250 tons fully loaded, with a top speed of just 16.5 knots, had already sailed ahead in early October to prepare Rosneath for their arrival. This created an impossible situation. Submarine Squadron 50 was crossing the Atlantic with arrival expected in late October. Rosneath lacked completed mooring facilities for multiple submarines, adequate fuel storage for extended operations, torpedo workshops for rearming, or proper maintenance buildings with overhead cranes and machine tools. The base that was supposed to support America's first European submarine offensive existed only partially, a construction site with scattered materials and incomplete buildings, not a combat facility ready to turn submarines around in days and send them back to hunting grounds. The Navy's solution was radical: send the Seabees. Into this gap stepped the 29th Naval Construction Battalion. Commissioned at Camp Allen, Virginia on October 4, 1942, they trained for barely 1 month at Camp Bradford, then moved to Davisville, Rhode Island, for equipment staging. The first echelon embarked overseas from Davisville on November 23, 1942. The second echelon departed in early December. Unlike the civilian contractors who had labored through 1941 and early 1942 under peacetime regulations and union rules, these were military engineers carrying toolkits and rifles, trained by the Marine Corps to function in combat zones, organized into self-contained units requiring no external support. They arrived to find Rosneath in organized chaos. Construction materials lay neatly labeled but uninstalled across the peninsula. Foundation work sat 3/4 complete. The marine railway existed as steel framework without operational machinery or power systems. 8 fuel tanks rose from the ground but lacked pumping stations, distribution lines, and safety systems. Most critically, adequate pier space for simultaneously mooring multiple submarines alongside the tender simply didn't exist. Submarines would have to anchor offshore and ferry crew and supplies by boat, a time-consuming process that would destroy the base's forward deployment advantage. The Seabees task list was staggering, and every item was mission-critical. Complete the marine railway and make it operational for submarine hull maintenance, capable of hauling 1,500-ton vessels from the water for repairs. Erect 4 complete workshops equipped for submarine repairs, electrical, engine, torpedo, and general machinery, each requiring overhead cranes, machine tools, welding equipment, and adequate power. Construct 20 Nissen huts for squadron quarters, each needing foundations, assembly, insulation, heating, lighting, and plumbing. Build or complete 8 10,000-barrel fuel tanks with a total capacity of 80,000 barrels of diesel, plus 2 pumping stations and underground fuel distribution lines running to mooring points. Establish a complete laundry facility capable of handling thousands of pounds of clothing daily. Pave access roads throughout the base area to handle heavy truck traffic. Renovate existing buildings for a 680-bed hospital and administration offices. Build mooring facilities allowing USS Beaver and 6 submarines to nest alongside simultaneously. Install complete utilities, water mains, electrical distribution, sewage systems across the entire base, and they had to do it before Submarine Squadron 50 arrived. The weather fought them every step. Scottish winter arrived in late November with freezing rain that turned construction sites into quagmires. Mud swallowed equipment. Winds off the Firth of Clyde made precise crane work nearly impossible. Darkness limited productive work to 8 hours daily. Temperatures hovered just above freezing, cold enough to make outdoor labor miserable, but not cold enough to freeze the mud into something workable. The Seabees worked anyway, often through the night when critical deadlines loomed, using portable floodlights powered by generators that consumed precious fuel. They weren't building to civilian standards with years to perfect every detail. They were building to war standards, functional, adequate, good enough to keep submarines operational and sailors alive. The workshops didn't need architectural beauty, they needed weatherproof walls, concrete floors strong enough to support machine tools, overhead cranes capable of lifting diesel engines, and adequate electrical power for welding and machining. The fuel tanks didn't need elaborate underground bunkers, they needed to store 80,000 barrels of diesel and deliver it to submarines on demand through pumps and pipes that wouldn't freeze in Scottish winter. The first submarines began arriving in late October and early November 1942, before construction was complete. USS Herring arrived at Rosneath on November 25, 1942, after supporting Operation Torch off the coast of Morocco. USS Barb arrived shortly after, having served as a beacon submarine guiding landing craft to North African beaches on November 8. USS Blackfish, USS Shad, USS Gurnard arrived throughout November. USS Gunnell limped in on December 7, 1942, 10 days behind schedule after all 4 diesel engines failed during the Atlantic crossing, leaving the submarine crawling at 3.5 knots on battery power alone. By early December 1942, as that last submarine finally reached Scotland, the base had transformed. The Marine Railway operated, capable of hauling submarines from the water for hull inspections and propeller repairs. 4 workshops stood complete with machine tools, overhead cranes, and adequate power. 4 of the 8 fuel tanks held diesel. Mooring facilities along the loch allowed USS Beaver to nest submarines 3 deep alongside for maintenance and resupply, with sailors walking across one submarine's deck to reach another. Torpedo handling equipment stood ready. The hospital operated with full medical staff. Barracks housed crews between patrols. It wasn't perfect. Construction continued through December and into early 1943 as remaining fuel tanks were completed, roads were improved, and additional facilities were added. But it was operational, which meant American submarines could conduct war patrols from Scotland, strike at German naval forces in the Bay of Biscay and Norwegian waters, then return to Rosneath for maintenance, refueling, rearming, and crew rest without the 2-week transit back to American ports that would have cut their time on patrol nearly in half. The transformation had taken roughly 6 weeks from the Seabees' arrival to functional operational status. What civilian contractors couldn't complete in 16 months, military engineers accomplished in 42 days, through round-the-clock work, acceptance of good enough rather than perfect, and the absolute refusal to acknowledge that any timeline was impossible. The true test of Rosneath wasn't construction, it was whether this hastily built base could actually support combat operations under wartime pressure. The answer came immediately. 5 of the 6 submarines departed almost as soon as they arrived to support Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa scheduled for November 8, 1942. They reconnoitered landing beaches under cover of darkness, provided navigation reference points for assault forces approaching unfamiliar coasts, and hunted Vichy French naval units that might interfere with the invasion. USS Herring, under Lieutenant Commander Raymond W. Johnson, reached her position off Casablanca on November 5, 1942, and remained submerged during daylight, spotting but not attacking several targets to avoid revealing American submarine presence before the invasion began. On the morning of November 8, as Operation Torch launched, Herring had her chance. At 0847 hours, she fired a spread of 4 torpedoes at the 5,700-ton Vichy French cargo ship Ville du Havre. 2 torpedoes struck home. The cargo ship, loaded with supplies intended for French forces in Morocco, sank in 14 minutes. All 102 crew members were rescued by escort vessels, but the supplies were lost. USS Barb, under Lieutenant Commander John R. Waterman, operated as a beacon submarine during the landings. Standing offshore inside the circle of ships bombarding the coast, Barb's navigation lights guided landing craft to their designated beaches, a critical role given that most assault troops were inexperienced and navigating unfamiliar waters in darkness. On November 9th, after the assault succeeded, Barb took station to intercept any Vichy French ships attempting to break out of Casablanca harbor. None appeared. The submarine ended her first patrol on November 25th when she arrived at Rosneath. USS Blackfish attacked a Vichy French convoy on November 11th, damaging the 2,400-ton colonial sloop Commandant Bory with a single torpedo hit that flooded her engine room but didn't sink her. The sloop limped back to port for months of repairs. USS Shad conducted reconnaissance of Spanish Morocco, gathering intelligence on coastal defenses and port facilities. USS Gurnard patrolled approaches to Gibraltar, ensuring no German U-boats interfered with Operation Torch supply lines. The submarines operated thousands of miles from Rosneath, but the base's value became immediately apparent when they returned in late November. They could refuel from those hastily built storage tanks, rearm torpedoes from the new workshops, conduct maintenance using the marine railway and repair facilities, and deploy again within 5 to 7 days rather than making the 2-week transit back to New London, Connecticut. This compressed turnaround time meant more days on patrol, more hunting opportunities, more pressure on Axis forces. After Operation Torch succeeded and North Africa fell to Allied control, the strategic picture shifted. The U.S. Navy needed to establish anti-U-boat patrols in the Bay of Biscay, the funnel through which every German submarine passed when transiting between bases in occupied France and hunting grounds in the Atlantic. Rosneath's location, roughly 1,200 nautical miles from Biscay patrol areas, made it ideal. American submarines could reach patrol stations in 3 days, conduct 2 weeks of hunting, and return to Rosneath for resupply, a cycle impossible from New London, which lay 3,000 nautical miles away across the entire Atlantic. USS Herring departed Rosneath on December 16, 1942, for her second war patrol, this time hunting in the Bay of Biscay. For 6 weeks, she patrolled transit routes used by U-boats, but encountered only fishing vessels and neutral merchant ships that couldn't be attacked under international law. She returned to Rosneath in February 1943 without kills. USS Barb departed January 10, 1943, for similar patrol areas with similar results. Hundreds of contacts investigated, none legitimate prey under rules of engagement. The other submarines of Squadron 50 rotated through Bay of Biscay patrols throughout winter and spring 1943. The lack of sinkings didn't indicate failure. It indicated that German U-boats, aware of American submarine presence, were transiting Bay of Biscay submerged or under heavy escort, making attacks nearly impossible. The mere presence of American submarines forced Germany to divert destroyers and aircraft to escort duties, ships and planes that otherwise would have hunted Allied convoys. Strategic success didn't always produce dramatic sinking statistics. In March 1943, USS Herring, now under Lieutenant Commander John Corbus, achieved the squadron's most significant kill. On March 23, 1943, while patrolling off the Spanish coast, Herring made contact with German submarine U-163, a Type 9XC U-boat. Corbus maneuvered Herring into firing position and launched a spread of 4 torpedoes from 1,200 yards. One torpedo struck U-163 amidships. The U-boat's pressure hull ruptured. She sank in less than 3 minutes, taking all 57 crew members down with her. Post-war German records confirmed the kill. This was submarine-on-submarine combat, the rarest and most difficult type of engagement. U-boats were small, maneuverable targets that spent most of their time submerged or semi-submerged, making detection and targeting extremely challenging. Herring's success demonstrated that American submarines operating from Rosneath could effectively hunt the hunters, turning U-boats from predators into prey in waters Germany considered safe. But by spring 1943, American and British leadership reassessed Submarine Squadron 50's role. Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, examined combat results. 1 U-boat confirmed sunk, several merchant vessels damaged, numerous patrols with no significant contacts. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, American submarines were decimating Japanese merchant shipping, routinely sinking multiple targets per patrol in an environment rich with vulnerable convoys. The Atlantic and European theaters simply didn't offer comparable opportunities. German naval forces remained concentrated in heavily defended Norwegian fjords. U-boats operated with destroyer and aircraft escort. Axis merchant traffic was minimal compared to Japan's vast merchant fleet. The decision came in spring 1943. Submarine Squadron 50 would redeploy to the Pacific. In April 1943, the squadron received orders for one final mission before returning to the United States. The Royal Navy requested American submarine support for patrols off Norway, watching for a possible breakout by the German battleship Tirpitz anchored in Altafjord and harassing U-boat training areas. USS Barb and USS Blackfish sailed first in April, followed by the others. The Norwegian patrols proved as frustrating as Bay of Biscay operations. The submarines conducted surveillance, gathered intelligence on German naval movements, and occasionally engaged targets. On April 28, 1943, a lookout on USS Barb spotted a periscope, a U-boat. The boats maneuvered for position, each trying to gain firing advantage, but neither achieved a shot and both withdrew. Tirpitz never left Altafjord during this period. Weather conditions above the Arctic Circle proved brutal, with ice, snow, and perpetual twilight making navigation and lookout duties exhausting. By July 1943, the experiment was over. On July 15, 1943, Submarine Squadron 50 departed Rosneath for the final time. They returned to New London, Connecticut, transited the Panama Canal, and deployed to Pearl Harbor. The 6 Gatto-class submarines that had operated from Rosneath would go on to distinguished Pacific careers. USS Barb, under Commander Eugene B. Fluckey, became one of the highest-scoring submarines of the war, ultimately credited with sinking 17 enemy vessels totaling 96,628 tons, including the 22,500-ton escort carrier Unyo. Fluckey received the Medal of Honor for Barb's 11th patrol, a daring penetration of Nam Quan Harbor on the China coast, where the submarine destroyed 30 ships at anchor. During her final patrol, Barb became the first submarine to use rockets in combat, shelling Japanese coastal towns, and landed a commando team that blew up a railroad train, the only American invasion of the Japanese home islands. USS Herring would not survive the war. On June 1, 1944, during her 8th patrol in the Kuril Islands, Herring attacked 2 merchant ships anchored at Matsuwa Island. She sank both vessels but was spotted by Japanese shore batteries, which scored 2 direct hits on her conning tower. Bubbles and heavy oil covered the surface. all 83 crew members perished. The wreck was discovered in 2016 at a depth of 104 meters. The squadron's modest combat results from Rosneath, one confirmed U-boat kill, several damaged merchant vessels, extensive intelligence gathering, didn't diminish the base's strategic success. Rosneath had proven its core concept. American military engineering could establish forward-deployed naval facilities anywhere on Earth faster than enemies could react, enabling power projection that would have been impossible from distant home ports. The speed that made Rosneath possible reflected a fundamental transformation in U.S. military construction philosophy that crystallized in the weeks after Pearl Harbor. On December 28, 1941, just 21 days after the Japanese attack, Rear Admiral Ben Morrill, chief of the Bureau of Yards and Docks, requested authority to establish Naval Construction Battalions. The Bureau of Navigation approved on January 5, 1942. 3 battalions received official authorization on March 5, 1942. They were designated Seabees, from the phonetic pronunciation of Seabee, Construction Battalion. Morrill's vision represented a radical departure from pre-war military construction practice. Before December 1941, the Navy contracted civilian construction firms to build bases through a bureaucratic process requiring competitive bidding, contract negotiations, civilian labor recruitment, adherence to federal construction codes, and oversight by multiple agencies. Projects routinely took years from authorization to completion. The submarine base at Pearl Harbor had required decades of gradual expansion. Naval Station Norfolk had evolved over 30 years. Building permanent installations with proper foundations, reinforced concrete, underground utilities, and architectural permanence was the accepted standard. This peacetime approach created insurmountable problems during war. Civilian contractors couldn't operate in combat zones. They had no legal protections under international law and could be executed as guerrillas if captured. They required elaborate logistic support, housing, food, medical care, security that military forces operating forward couldn't provide. They couldn't be ordered to work under fire or accept dangerous assignments. Their skills, while considerable, focused on permanent construction using traditional methods and materials. The Seabees embodied something entirely different. Military construction units composed of experienced tradesmen recruited directly from civilian industry, equipped with military rank and weapons training, commanded by Civil Engineer Corps officers who understood both engineering and military operations, organized in self-contained battalions of approximately 1,000 men carrying their own equipment and supplies. The first volunteers averaged 37 years old, men who had built Boulder Dam, national highways, New York skyscrapers, steel mills, oil refineries, aircraft carriers, and every type of infrastructure American industry had produced. They knew more than 60 skilled trades and brought that expertise directly into uniform. The trade-off Morrill accepted was profound. Seabee construction would never match the quality, permanence, or architectural refinement of civilian contractors working to peacetime standards. Rosneath's facilities were functional but crude, prefabricated Nissen huts instead of permanent barracks with brick walls and tile roofs, above-ground fuel tanks instead of underground concrete bunkers, gravel roads instead of paved highways, portable machine tools instead of permanently installed equipment, wooden piers instead of concrete wharves. The marine railway used equipment that could be disassembled and relocated rather than permanent infrastructure intended for decades of service. Every choice prioritized speed over permanence. Nissen huts, half-cylinder structures of corrugated steel over curved ribs, could be erected in days by small crews using standardized parts shipped from factories. They provided adequate shelter, but lacked insulation, soundproofing, and comfort. Above-ground fuel tanks required only concrete foundations and welded steel construction, taking weeks instead of the months needed for underground installations. They were vulnerable to air attack, but Rosneath's remote location and heavy forest cover made such attacks unlikely. Gravel roads could be graded and surfaced in days using bulldozers and dump trucks, adequate for the base's expected lifespan of perhaps 2 or 3 years. This philosophy bought something invaluable: speed measured in weeks rather than years. The 29th Seabees at Rosneath weren't optimizing for longevity extending into the 1950s and 1960s. They were optimizing for operational capability in December 1942. Every day earlier that submarines could refuel and rearm at Rosneath instead of returning to American ports meant additional days on patrol, more convoy protection, more pressure on German forces. The crude fuel tanks delivered diesel just as effectively as elaborate underground installations. The Nissen huts kept sailors warm and dry through Scottish winter as well as brick barracks. The workshops maintained submarines adequately despite lacking architectural distinction or the precision tolerances of shipyard facilities. The Seabees' unofficial motto captured this mindset perfectly. The difficult we do immediately. The impossible takes a little longer. Rosneath demonstrated that this approach worked. 6 weeks from the Seabees' arrival to operational status, 42 days from scattered materials and incomplete construction to a functioning submarine base. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't permanent, it wasn't built to last, but it was operational when strategy demanded it, and in war, operational capability delivered on time beat perfect construction delivered too late. The compressed timeline and crude construction methods extracted costs that became apparent only after Rosneath entered operation. Submarine crews discovered problems immediately upon arrival. The hastily paved roads broke apart under heavy truck traffic within months, forcing constant repairs. Every supply run from Glasgow churned the gravel into muddy ruts during wet weather. The above-ground fuel tanks, while functional, presented security vulnerabilities. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed Rosneath multiple times during 1943. The fuel tanks stood out clearly in aerial photos, 8 perfect circles arranged in neat rows. Only heavy fighter patrols and Scotland's perpetual overcast prevented German bombing raids. Winter storms exposed inadequate weatherproofing in several Nissen huts. The curved steel walls conducted cold directly into living spaces. Seams between sections leaked during heavy rain. Sailors stuffed rags into gaps and hung blankets as interior insulation, but Scottish winter still penetrated. Respiratory infections spread through cramped quarters where men slept in 3-tier bunks with barely 18 inches of personal space. The workshops functioned but proved inadequate for major overhauls. When USS Gunnell's 4 diesel engines failed during transit to Scotland, leaving the submarine crawling at 3.5 knots on battery power alone, repair crews at Rosneath lacked the specialized tools, replacement parts, and technical expertise to fully rebuild the engines. They patched what they could, jury-rigged solutions using available parts, but Gunnell remained partially disabled throughout her time in Scottish waters. Her patrol reports noted repeated engine problems, limiting speed and operational capability. Similar maintenance limitations meant submarines needing significant repairs, cracked pressure hull welds, damaged periscopes, failing electrical systems had to return to American shipyards, negating much of Rosneath's forward deployment advantage. The human cost emerged more subtly but cut deeper. The 29th Seabees worked through brutal conditions throughout November and December 1942. Scottish winter rain fell nearly every day. Mud covered everything. Darkness limited productive work to 8 miserable hours. They lived in tents initially, then crude barracks while building facilities for others. Battalion medical logs recorded increasing cases of pneumonia, bronchitis, trench foot from working in perpetually wet boots, and exhaustion-related injuries throughout November and December. One Seabee, riding home in January 1943, described Rosneath as cold, wet, and about as cheerful as a graveyard at midnight. Another noted that we built a base here, but I'm not sure why anyone would want to be based here. The work itself provided purpose, but the location offered nothing. Rosneath was 24 miles from Glasgow by winding roads. The nearest entertainment was Helensburgh, a small town offering little beyond a few pubs and weekly dances at Coveburg Hall. American servicemen accustomed to stateside entertainments found Scotland inhospitable. British rationing meant fresh vegetables and meat were scarce. Social interactions with locals proved awkward. American informal friendliness clashed with Scottish reserve. Submarine crews found conditions equally challenging. Between patrols, sailors had nothing to do. The base offered no movie theater, no bowling alley, no recreation facilities beyond what individual ingenuity created. The Ferry Inn, a Victorian-era building commandeered by the Navy as officers' quarters, provided the only comfortable space, and even that was reserved for officers. Enlisted men made do in Nissen huts that rattled in the wind and leaked in the rain. More fundamentally, the strategic value remained debatable. Submarine Squadron 50 conducted 27 war patrols from Rosneath between November 1942 and July 1943. Combat results proved modest. One confirmed U-boat kill, U-163, by Herring, several auxiliary vessels destroyed, a handful of merchant ships damaged. This paled beside Pacific submarine operations, where American boats routinely sank multiple targets per patrol. USS Wahoo, operating from Pearl Harbor during the same period, sank 20 ships totaling 60,000 tons in just 4 patrols. USS Silversides sank 23 ships totaling 90,080 tons during her wartime career. The European theater simply didn't offer the target-rich environment of the Pacific. German naval forces remained concentrated in heavily defended Norwegian fjords, protected by destroyers, torpedo boats, shore batteries, and air cover. U-boats transited the Bay of Biscay submerged or under escort, presenting few attack opportunities. Axis merchant traffic between occupied Europe and neutral nations was minimal and heavily guarded. American submarine tactics developed for Pacific operations, aggressive surface attacks at night, long-range independent patrols, bold penetrations of harbors and anchorages, couldn't adapt easily to European conditions, where every patrol area was within range of land-based aircraft and enemy forces concentrated in defensive formations. The patrols weren't useless. Intelligence gathering proved valuable. Submarine commanders reported German naval movements, convoy routes, coastal defenses, mine locations. The mere presence of American submarines forced Germany to divert destroyers and aircraft to escort duties. But measured purely by tonnage sunk, Rosneath's submarines achieved a fraction of what their Pacific counterparts accomplished. This reality drove the decision to withdraw Squadron 50 in July 1943. The Navy needed every submarine in the Pacific, where Japan's merchant fleet offered thousands of vulnerable targets. American submarine production was accelerating. New Gato-class boats were commissioning monthly, but crew training took time and experienced commanders were irreplaceable. Keeping 6 submarines and 400-plus experienced submariners in European waters, where targets proved scarce, made no strategic sense when the Pacific campaign was throttling Japanese supply lines. After Squadron 50 departed, Rosneath didn't close. On February 1, 1943, the U.S. Navy had already returned most facilities to the Royal Navy, retaining only submarine-specific infrastructure. When the American submarines left in July, even those facilities were transferred. But on August 20, 1943, the base recommissioned as U.S. Naval Receiving Station Rosneath, a processing center for American naval personnel arriving in the United Kingdom. Between August 1943 and August 1944, thousands of sailors passed through Rosneath for assignment to ships and stations throughout Britain. The hastily built barracks housed transient personnel. The hospital treated combat casualties evacuated from European waters. The workshops repaired small craft and equipment. Rosneath supported training and supply operations for the 11th Amphibious Force, 1,900 men preparing for the Normandy invasion, and other units gathering for D-Day. This revealed Rosneath's true value: flexibility. The hastily constructed base could pivot to new missions as strategic priorities shifted: submarine operations, personnel processing center, amphibious training facility, supply depot. Permanent concrete infrastructure built to peacetime standards would have locked the base into its original submarine support mission. The Seabees' crude but adaptable construction allowed Rosneath to serve whatever purpose the war demanded at any given moment. When submarines weren't needed, the facility supported other operations without expensive modifications. Construction timeline: July 1941. Civilian contractor work begins under Lend-Lease arrangements. June 12, 1942, civilian contractors reassigned to petroleum pipeline project, Rosneath work incomplete. November 23 to December 22, 29th Naval Construction Battalion arrives and completes critical facilities, 42 days from Seabee arrival to operational submarine base status. February 1, 1943, most facilities return to Royal Navy, submarine operations continue. July 15, 1943, Submarine Squadron 50 departs for Pacific reassignment. Facilities constructed at Rosneath. Marine railway capable of hauling 1,500-ton submarines for hull maintenance. 4 complete workshops, electrical, engine, torpedo, and general machinery repairs. 8 10,000-barrel fuel tanks, 80,000-barrel total diesel storage capacity. 2 fuel pumping stations with underground distribution piping to mooring points. 20 Nissen huts providing quarters for 200-plus submarine personnel. 680-bed hospital, civilian construction completed by Seabees. Extensive road network connecting all base facilities. Mooring facilities for USS Beaver, AS-5, and 6 submarines simultaneously nested alongside. Submarine Squadron 50, 6 Gato-class submarines. USS Barb, SS-220, 12 war portrayals total, 5 from Rosneath. Pacific career, 17 ships sunk, 96,628 tons. USS Blackfish, SS-221, 4 war portrayals from Rosneath. Pacific career, 8 confirmed kills. USS Herring, SS-233, 4 war portrayals from Rosneath, sank U-163 March 23, 1943, lost with all hands June 1, 1944. USS Shad, SS-235, 4 war portrayals from Rosneath, sank German auxiliary minesweeper M4242. USS Gunnell, SS-253, 4 war portrayals from Rosneath, despite chronic engine problems. USS Gurnard, SS-254, 4 war portrayals from Rosneath, Pacific career, 11 confirmed kills. Combat results from Rosneath, November 1942, July 1943, 27 war portrayals conducted by Squadron 50, 1 confirmed U-boat kill, U-163, type IXC, 57 crew lost. 1 confirmed merchant sinking, Ville du Havre, 5,700 tons, Operation Torch. Several auxiliary vessels and small craft destroyed. Extensive intelligence gathering on German naval movements, convoy routes, coastal defenses. 0 American submarines lost during Rosneath operations. Personnel: 29th Naval Construction Battalion, approximately 1,000 Seabees. Submarine Squadron 50, 400-plus officers and enlisted submariners. USS Beaver, AS-5, crew 348 officers and enlisted. Hospital staff, 200-plus medical personnel, arrived August 15, 1942. August 1943 through August 1944, peak population, 6,300 U.S. Personnel as receiving station. Post-submarine operations. August 20, 1943, recommissioned as U.S. Naval Receiving Station. August 1943 to August 1944, processed thousands of personnel for UK assignments. Supported 11th Amphibious Force, 1,900 men preparing for Normandy. Provided housing, training facilities, and supply support for D-Day preparations. May 5, 1945, U.S. Navy decommissioning ceremony. June 1945, final Seabee units withdrawn. 1948, base permanently closed, facilities dismantled. Patterson stood on that same pier in May 1945, watching the last American flag descend over Rosneath. Victory in Europe had come 3 days earlier. The base that had risen from mud in 6 weeks during fall 1942 was being handed back to the British after nearly 4 years of American operation. In 3 years, Rosneath's mission had evolved from submarine forward base to amphibious training center to personnel receiving station to war's end, exactly the flexibility that expeditionary construction philosophy promised. The irony was complete. German intelligence had largely ignored Rosneath, viewing the remote Scottish peninsula as strategically irrelevant. The rapid construction timeline meant U-boat reconnaissance and Luftwaffe aerial photography missed the base's establishment entirely. By the time German Naval Command realized American submarines operated from Scotland in early 1943, Squadron 50 had already completed its primary missions and was preparing for redeployment. The stealth wasn't intentional, it was simply the byproduct of building faster than enemies could gather and process intelligence. What Rosneath proved wasn't that submarines could operate effectively from Scottish waters. Modest combat results suggested European waters offered limited opportunities compared to the Pacific. What it proved was something more valuable. American military engineering had achieved the capacity to project naval power anywhere on Earth by building the infrastructure to support it faster than enemies could react. This capability would define every subsequent amphibious operation. Every forward base, every island airstrip from Guadalcanal to Okinawa to the eventual invasion of Japan. The 29th Seabees moved on from Rosneath, deploying to southern England in 1944 to build port facilities and supply depots for the Normandy invasion, then crossing to France after D-Day to construct advance bases following Allied forces inland. Other Seabee battalions spread across every theater. 116 battalions total by war's end, 325,000 men who built infrastructure on 6 continents. They constructed 111 major airstrips capable of handling heavy bombers, 441 piers and port facilities, 2,558 ammunition magazines, 700 square blocks of warehouses, hospitals treating 70,000 patients, storage tanks holding 100 million gallons of fuel, and housing for 1.5 million men. They did this well armed, frequently under fire, and to timelines that civilian contractors would have dismissed as physically impossible. The broader implications extended beyond World War II. When the Cold War required forward air bases across Europe and Asia, American engineering corps built them in months. When conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and the Middle East demanded expeditionary infrastructure, descendants of the Seabees created it. The principle tested at Rosneath: build fast, build functional, accept temporary solutions over permanent perfection, and move on when strategic priorities shift, became foundational to American military operations worldwide. Modern expeditionary warfare descends directly from lessons learned at places like Rosneath. Balad Air Base, rising from a rocky desert in 2003, housing 36,000 personnel and handling more daily flights than Chicago O'Hare. Forward operating bases throughout Afghanistan appearing in weeks and disappearing just as quickly when units redeployed. Mobile port facilities that transformed undeveloped coastlines into logistics hubs, all inherited the philosophy Rear Admiral Morial articulated in December 1941. Military engineering must prioritize speed and operational capability over permanence and perfection. Today, almost nothing survives of Rosneath's wartime existence. The Nissen huts were removed by 1948, sold as surplus or cut up for scrap metal. The marine railway was dismantled and shipped elsewhere for reuse. The fuel tanks were drained, cleaned, and demolished. The workshops became storage buildings briefly before demolition. Housing developments cover what were once mooring facilities. Roads followed different routes. Only a memorial cairn on the shore marks where thousands of Americans built the first major U.S. naval base on mainland Britain, and then departed 3 years later, leaving barely a trace. But the principle endures in every theater where American forces operate. The Seabees' motto wasn't poetry or propaganda, it was operational doctrine, tested under the worst conditions and proven successful. We build, we fight. The weapon that made Rosneath possible wasn't torpedoes or submarines or naval guns. It was wrenches, bulldozers, concrete, welding torches, and the absolute refusal to accept that any timeline was impossible or any location unsuitable. When American strategy needed a forward submarine base in Scotland, engineers built it in 42 days. When D-Day required port facilities in Normandy, Seabees constructed them under fire. When Pacific Islands required airstrips for B-29s capable of reaching Japan, military engineers graded jungle into runways in under a month. This was the advantage Germany and Japan couldn't match. Not firepower, not tactics, not courage, but the raw industrial and engineering capacity to turn any patch of earth into a functional military base before enemies realized construction had even begun. Speed became its own weapon. Flexibility became strategic advantage. Temporary solutions delivered on time beat permanent installations delivered too late. At Rosneath, in the rain and mud of a Scottish winter, that weapon proved decisive. The submarines that operated from those crude facilities went on to distinguished Pacific careers, sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of enemy shipping. The Seabees, who built the base in 6 weeks, went on to construct infrastructure on every front. The principle established there, build fast, build anywhere, build whatever the mission requires, continues to define American military engineering 7 decades later. Captain Norman S. Ives, who commanded Squadron 50 during Rosneath operations, didn't live to see war's end. On August 2, 1944, while serving as director of the captured French port of Cherbourg, Ives led a reconnaissance party toward the town of Saint-Malo, which he'd been told was secured. It wasn't. 500 German paratroopers ambushed the party. Ives and 6 others died in a 3-hour firefight. He was 46 years old, a 1920 Naval Academy graduate who had won the Navy Cross for submarine rescue innovations and then proven that American submarines could operate effectively from forward bases established in weeks rather than years. The submarines returned to the Pacific. The Seabees moved on to new projects. Rosneath faded into history, but the lesson remained, carved not in stone memorials but in operational doctrine. Engineering speed creates strategic flexibility, and strategic flexibility wins wars.